So this is Mark Olsey with Pledge Talk. We're in the community, the learning. Need everybody to mute if you haven't done that. That'd be great. Okay. And tonight is the first of 4 classes entitled Story. So I want to tell you a little bit about why I've chosen to do a class on this. As a marriage counselor, and I've done a lot of individual counseling as well, I have sat with hundreds, perhaps thousands of people and listening to them tell me all kinds of challenges that they have faced, questions that they've had about their own life or their own relationships that they've not been able to understand, areas where they need help in. And I came to understand every single person I've ever worked with by keeping one thing in mind, and that is this: they all have a story that needs to be heard. And by listening to their stories, just that alone, they felt great encouragement and no longer alone. And literally, just from that, I could see them beginning to experience help. The other reason is I'm aware I have story taking place in my life all the time, every day. And I'm so grateful for when someone is willing to listen to me, to tell stories taking place in my life. It makes a huge difference. So that's some of the incentive about why I want to teach on story and the power of understanding other people's stories and others understanding your story, our present story and our past story, and how it relates to our present story, everyday story, and then how, if we understand our past story and how it works with our present story, it will really help us to formulate a more positive future story. And that's what I want for you, as I want for my own life as well. So those are a few bits of the why I'm teaching this course. So as we go along, there's 3 ideas that are true for all of us. Oh, and before I say this, no need to take notes, because virtually everything I say tonight is going to be in notes tomorrow. I really kind of want you to just sit back and just kind of listen and wonder and ponder with me over everything I say tonight. I'm not saying you can't take notes, but you don't necessarily need to, because that's all going to be in the notes that I'm going to put out tomorrow. Because I'm going to tell you a story, and that story will be there tomorrow. So again, starting off with, I want to tell you that there's 3 ideas that are true for all of us. And that is, the first is this: we all have present story playing out in our lives, in our heads all the time. We're in a story. Story is happening in our life. And we are all, if you will, we all have present story that's playing out in our lives, in our heads all the time. The second thing is, we all have a past story, again, that's affecting our present story. I believe literally every day of our lives, our past story is having some kind of effect on us. That's inescapable. That's true for all of us. And thirdly, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, we all have a future story yet to be played out that will be influenced by how we handle our past and our present story. These are ideas that are true for all of us. So by teaching this class tonight on present story, here's my desire, that what comes out of this. My desire is that all of us together, including myself, that we will recognize more readily the following 3 things. We'll recognize more readily that there is story to listen to in our own heads. Yeah. There's story for you to listen to in your own head, to take note of and process. All day, every day, there's story to listen to in our own heads. I also desire, then hope that as a result of taking the class, we will recognize more readily that there's story in other people's lives to be heard and appreciated. And thirdly, that there is story in the minds of both parties that needs to be heard when we're in the midst of a conflict. We'll be talking about those tonight. The second desire is that we will become more active at implementing the means to listen to and learn from the story in our head, learn of the story in others, and listen to the story in the minds of us and another when we're in conflict. That we'll be more active at implementing the means to do that. That's my hope and desire from the class tonight. All right, I want to start with the first point, that we will recognize more readily there's story to listen to in our own heads, to take note of and process, that we will recognize more readily that story. So recently, I want to tell you a story. Recently, I took another dip down into the darkness of frustration, anger, and depression. You might remember me sharing from a couple of classes ago when we talked about emotions that I have a lot of emotions that I experience, and I'm very aware of a wide range of emotions that I experience, and that my emotions go up and down quite a bit. Well, that was happening again just recently, and I was again going down. I could feel myself going down into the darkness of frustration, anger, and depression. Now, again, as I share this, I want you to think story. Listen to the story. Listen to learn from the story that I'm sharing. I was aware in my head, I was aware that in the midst of these emotions, I was just pulling back. I was pulling back away from just doing anything. I was pulling away from my wife and really away from life itself. By the time night had come and Zarin was going to bed, I had become quite despondent and immobile. And I was just all in my head. And I became aware that I hadn't even talked much to Zarin that night, and that potentially she could fear something was wrong between us. And it wasn't. It all had to do, I knew it had all had to do with me and what was happening in my world. I knew it would be best for me to tell her that, so at least she would know it wasn't her and she could relax. Because sometimes somebody's getting quiet, they're not being very communicative, and we start wondering, is something wrong between us? And I wanted to know that was not the case. I wanted to be able to relax. So I thought it would be good for me to go tell her. But I couldn't seem to even get off the couch to go tell her. I felt so immobile. Finally, I mustered the strength or resolve to do so, and I crawled off the couch and made my way back to the bedroom, where I found my wife almost asleep, and I whispered to her that I wanted her to know that what I was going through, again, wasn't her at all. Her and I were fine. It was just me. She thanked me for coming and telling her and said it made her feel better, and I'm sure helped her sleep better too. Then I went back out onto the couch. As I sat there, tapes began playing through my head. Like, you'll never figure this out. Why are you doing all this anyways? You should just go back to counseling full time. That would make life a whole lot easier. Why are you trying to do counseling and the pledge talk and so forth? Why are you trying to do more than you can? You ought to just go back to one. Compared to all the time you're putting into pledge talk, you really aren't accomplishing much, Like, why are you doing this? I just was hearing these voices in my head. Then there was silence, followed by more similar tapes playing through my head. Now, as I tell you my story, I hope you're still simply listening. I hope you're not formulating things you want to tell me or answers you want to give me or anything like that. I hope instead you're still intrigued and simply wanting to hear more. Remember, I'm telling you the story in my head. So my thoughts went on. I wish I had someone I could talk to about all of this. What good is that going to do? You've talked to plenty of others about this, and still here you are. You're still frustrated about not trying to somehow manage everything as well as you would like. Talking to someone isn't ever going to get you anywhere. There really aren't any answers. Not sure how long that went on, but I finally went to bed. The next morning, I woke up with a song in my mind. It happens quite a bit to me. It's just kind of amazing how it happens. The song that was going through my mind was all about me getting an old song that I knew from years and years ago that I had thought about for years. But it was a song that went through my mind that it was all about me getting closer to God. Huh. It was really interesting. And I didn't put two and two together for quite a while. I mean, like, why that song? Why was that going through my mind? Now, again, I'm hoping that if there's anyone in class tonight or listening to this recording sometime later, that when I mention God, I hope your response is not, oh, there he goes talking about God somehow, or throwing that into the picture. I hope I haven't lost you. I hope you're staying focused. Because after all, I'm just telling you my story. I hope you just keep listening to my story, because that's all I'm doing is telling you the story. I didn't plan on feeling down and discouraged in these particular days, nor did I plan to wake up that next day having a song on my mind that I heard when I was a boy about getting close to God. That just happened. It was just my story. All I want to say is, are you still listening to my story? That morning, I had scheduled a walk with a friend, a man just a bit older than me, but who has become a real example and a real mentor in my life. But that morning, when I woke up, I didn't really feel like going. I didn't feel like talking about anything. I was still kind of down in the dumps. And then especially with the voices still in my head from the night before that were saying, what good is that going to do? You've talked to a lot of people about learning how to try to manage life better, and you never figured it out, never got anywhere. The voice is still ringing, but I went anyway, thinking maybe instead I could just listen to him and maybe somehow be a bit of encouragement to him, not really expecting anything happening from him to me. So I went. We met at Sedgwick County Park and walked around. And began a conversation. Are you still intrigued? Are you still listening? Still wondering? I hope so. Because this leads me to the second point, that there's a story in other people's lives to be heard and appreciated. I was experiencing a story. Well, I met my friend. And again, I had very little expectation of anything coming out of it for my good. Only maybe a little hope that I could be helpful to him. But the most amazing thing happened. This friend, he is such an incredible friend. He is so aware that there is story playing out in other people's lives all the time, that there's story to be heard and appreciated. He's so aware of that. And he is so good at just being present and listening, that somehow, before I even realized, I ended up talking all about what had been going on in my mind, in my life the last few days. And by the end of our walk together, he helped me see and understand some things about myself I have struggled with for years and had never made sense. I was so encouraged My spirit was lifted. It's like my soul was alive again. And I wanted to get back into life because of a friend who knew how to be present and listen to story. Interesting. Later that day, I had scheduled another appointment with another friend. And I hadn't seen this person for quite a while, and I was looking forward to being with them as well. Now, when we met, the friend was happy to see me, and soon into the conversation, I was asked about what all was going on in my life and what I was doing with Pledge Talk. By this time, because my spirits were lifted and so forth, I was more interested in talking. So I began to share what was happening in my life and in the Pledge Talk learning community. Sadly, however, no more than 2 sentences into what I was wanting to say, this friend started talking. Something I said triggered a thought in that person's mind, and off they went, talking and talking and talking. And I just sat and listened. A few more times I tried to speak up because that's what they originally wanted me. They wanted me to share. So I tried speaking up a little bit more about some things that were going on in my life and the creation of the Pledge Talk learning community and so forth. And every time I did, the exact same thing happened. I got 2 or 3 sentences into what I was saying, and apparently something else I said triggered them, and off they were talking again about things they wanted to talk about. At the end, I was thanked for a great conversation, and our time was over. I walked away from that conversation saddened. Not for me. My spirits were still lifted because of my earlier morning conversation. But I was saddened for my second friend, who seemed to really have no idea that I had felt completely missed in that conversation. It might have been a good conversation for that friend, but it wasn't for me. I was just glad to see that friend, and I care for them, but there wasn't any real connection between them. I thought about it for a while, and I thought, I would clear my schedule in a heartbeat to be with my first friend, but not my second friend. I felt loved, encouraged, strengthened, and connected to my first friend, but left empty by my second. Hear me carefully when I say this. I'm not saying it is all about me, that when a friend is with me, the time and the focus should be all about me. What I am hoping will happen as I teach this course is that we will all recognize and be mindful that there is story in others' lives to be heard and appreciated. My first friend knows this so well, and it had an incredible impact on me that day and since that day. Virtually every time I'm with that friend, I am encouraged in some way or another. And I believe he is too, because we both listen for story. Sadly, my second friend doesn't even seem to think about the story in anyone else's life. Or maybe not even, maybe isn't even aware. I don't know, but maybe not even aware that a deeper connection can be experienced by listening and appreciating to story in someone else's life. It's incredible. So again, The first two summary statements: there is story to listen to in our own heads, to take note of and process. And second of all, there is story in others' lives to be heard and appreciated. The third point I was making then tonight is that there is story in the minds of both parties when in the midst of a conflict. We say there's a story in my head about what went down back there. Let me give you a couple examples. I have a friend who told me once that he learned early on in his marriage that he would ask his wife to go out on a date, and consistently she would say no. And he realized over time that he began to feel like the kids were more important than he was, or at least that was the story in his head. Then he found out later the story in her head. He said he discovered that she always operates better when she has time to prepare. He said, when I would on the spur of the moment ask her out, it'd be kind of overwhelming for her because of all that she had been planning for the day, for the night, and all the adjusting that she'd have to make right at that moment. And so she would always say no. But the reality was she was fine with the idea about going out, and indeed wanted to go out, but she needed time in advance to plan. And when he realized that was the case, it made all the difference in the world. To sort that out, he needed to understand and see the story that was in his head and find out later the story that was in her head. Learning the story and the different stories helped bring about a significant change, so that thereafter, he said, let's plan a certain time then to do a date. And she said, fine. And they've been doing that ever since, simply by paying attention and learning the story in each person's head. A second example is a wife who wants to connect with her husband, but every time she tries to engage with her husband, he's too busy. And she feels like she doesn't matter to him. Or at least that's the story in her head. He doesn't care about me. His work and his projects are the only things that really matter. He's so selfish. That was the story in her head. This woman's husband, on the other hand, feels a great burden to take care of them financially. He was telling me, as they've encountered a number of unexpected heavy expenses over the last few years. And all he can think about is keeping ahead of the bank, just enough so they don't foreclose on them. He doesn't want his wife to feel the insecurity of losing their home, remembering how much she felt that kind of experience growing up. But he added that he notices her frustration as she regularly accuses him of not caring for her and the family. And the story in his head was, she's so unappreciative of everything I do. Nothing I do around here matters. It's like it's all about her. Two completely different stories. In reality, in this story, as in most stories I hear when I work with people in conflict, is that they really do care about the other person. They are simply living out their lives with different stories in their heads that are far more often wrong than not. It's so important that we take time to listen to the stories in each other's heads when we're in conflict. It opens the door to the resolving of that conflict. A few more thoughts. We have to realize and recognize that stories affect this. Whether the stories that I'm experiencing myself, it affects me, and it would really be helpful and good for me to seek to process it one way or another. Helpful to realize that the people around me are being affected by stories in their lives. And wow, the impact that I could have on them by listening to their story. And then thirdly, wow, the stories that are going on in my head or another person's head or two other people's heads, if they're in conflict, is having a huge effect on their relationship, and how important it is that we all learn to take note of what those stories are. To love well and have the best chance of resolving conflict, the stories need to be heard and validated. Okay. So I've said so far, my hope is, my desire is that in the class is that we recognize more readily that there's story to listen to in our own heads, that there's stories in other people's lives that need to be heard and appreciated, and there's story in the minds of both parties when they're in the midst of a conflict. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about the idea that how important it is to do all we can to implement means to listen to and learn from the story in our head, or the story in others' lives, or the story in the minds of both parties when we're in conflict. So just a few thoughts. And again, these are all in the notes, just some ideas of how to do this, how to consider and recognize the stories in our own heads. It must take time to reflect. All of this takes time. It must take time to reflect on our own stories. Taking time to journal and or pray if you are a praying person. Or find someone like I did to talk about the story in our head when we can't sort it out. But to do that, you need to find a good listener. And one of our hopes, literally, with the Place Talk learning community is that over time, relationships will be established in the community, that we can become good friends and listeners to each other. Now, some of you may have a spouse, a friend, or a family member who already is a really good listener. Many people don't have someone like that. Our hope that in the community, we can learn to do that even for each other. We also must consider what it takes and how to learn of and appreciate story in general, in each other's lives. And to do that, it takes a commitment to live a life where, again, our purpose in living life and going throughout life is to love well. It takes the idea of living increasingly with an other-centered approach. When I go to work, when I go to a team meeting, a small group meeting, when I come home with my spouse, with a child, it takes an awareness that there's story to be heard. And if I want to love well, then I want to live with an other-centered approach to learn of the story. It takes that. It takes also the slowing down of our conversations. I've been slowing down even as we talk here, hoping that you're taking in and thinking about all that I've shared. It takes a slowing down of conversations, a slowing down of the tendencies we have to interject. The second friend, he was not aware at all of his tendency to jump right in and interject the slowing down of the conversation wasn't a part of his mindset at all. He wasn't having an other-centered approach to stay in the mindset of listening to me. Also, to live this out well, this is where pledge, all the steps of pledge, comes into play so well. And if you're new to the community and you don't know what pledge is all about, I strongly want to recommend that you go back to that courses tab and scroll up to the top of the list of the courses. And there's 3 different ways you can learn about pledge. It's the foundation of everything we're teaching. It's the process by which you can learn most significantly about how to love well when you listen to others in a conversation. All right, one more final little thought about when we're in conversation with others in a general sense. What are some conversation starters? I don't know that these actually work, quite honestly, exactly what I'm going to say. I mean, no, it sounds terrible as I start this off, but I thought it'd be interesting for us to experiment maybe. The ways you can start off a conversation with someone that you're just kind of hanging out with is you might say something like, hey, tell me a story of what's been happening in your life or family or work. Tell me a story. Or tell me the story of, or a story of what's been playing out in your head. Maybe someone says, I had a tough day, and you might say, so what's the story in your head about what's been playing out because of the day or what took place that you just told me about? What's the story in your head? Be interesting to consider. If it doesn't work, we just go back to saying, just literally opening up any conversation by saying, hey, tell me what's going on. I'd like to hear. And then being sure to stay other-centered and to use the principles of pledge. Finally, we must consider what it takes and how to learn and appreciate story in each other's heads when it comes to conflict. And this takes a commitment to love well also, and courage. Because it can be hard to invite someone to tell us about the story in their head. You might remember that in the bite-sized video pledge, if you listen to that, of course, if you've ever listened to that, I tell the story of my daughter, who a number of years ago, who came home for a weekend. She lives in Tulsa, but she came home for a weekend and needed just some time with Mom and I. She'd been through a rough period. She had broken up with a guy that I think was probably going to ask her to marry her. She had a rough 2 years, or second year, I should say, of her kindergarten teacher, just some teaching. She had some rough kids that she had in her class. And she had just been in a car accident a few weeks prior and really did some harm to her back. And she was really concerned and worried about that. So she came home just to talk and that kind of gets her emotional tank filled up, I think. And we had a great time together. End of the weekend, we said goodbye, and she left, drove home, and it's a 3-hour drive. And during that 3 hours, I began having some ideas and thoughts about some things that I hadn't told her yet, or wished I would have told her. So I began writing an email. And the more I wrote, the more some amazing ideas came to my mind. And I started writing out some brilliant thoughts and incredible wisdom that was coming out in everything that I was sharing. And I was just sure that as soon as she got home, she'd click on her email and she'd call me up and start crying and saying, oh, Dad, you're so amazing. All these things you wrote me. Thanks for all of your love and so forth. And I was just sure that was going to happen. And it didn't. It didn't happen that night. It didn't happen the next night. It didn't happen the next 3 days. In fact, it didn't happen for a week. She didn't call me. Well, when she finally did, she called me up and said, hey, Dad. I said, hey, sweetie, how are you doing? And she said, yeah, well, I'm doing okay. And she said, Dad, do you remember that email you wrote about a week ago? And I said, well, sure, hon. Yeah, I was kind of wondering if you had gotten that. And she said, well, yeah. And she said, well, Dad, when I read that email, I actually was kind of like, I was kind of mad because I felt like you were treating me more like I was listening on the phone. She said, I felt like you kind of treating me more like a little girl than a grown woman. This was my response. I put the phone down so she couldn't hear my thoughts. But in my mind, I was having all kinds of things like, what do you mean? Treating her like a little girl? I know you're a grown woman. I wasn't doing that. And you were just home. You've had a tough time. I know you had a tough time. We just had a great weekend together. And I'm your dad. And besides that, I'm a counselor. I got all kinds of great thoughts to share with you. And I'm just going on and on and on and on like this. And then I remembered some of the Pledge Talk principles, like the very first one, that it's a good thing that I was pausing and not saying all that out loud. Then I remember the next step, to listen and to draw her out. And so I put the phone back up and I said, honey, tell me more. Tell me more. What helped? What was it that I said or did or wrote that kind of made you feel that way? Well, that took courage on my part. That's the reason I'm telling you the story. It takes courage to even invite somebody to tell you even more, because it's kind of hard to hear that kind of stuff. But I can tell you this, because I had the courage at the moment and the wherewithal and the remembrance of what Pledge is all about. And I asked her to tell me more of the story in her head. She told me more. And I was able to echo and disarm the tension by validating. And it was a huge plus to our relationship. Listening to another person's story, even in the midst of the conflict, is huge. In a way, to start off conversations like that is simply using the idea of something like, hey, Dad, I got a story in my head right now. Or, hey, honey, to my spouse, or to a friend, or my brother. Hey, man, I got a story in my head right now. Or to my son, or someone else. I could always start off the conversation. Hey, I got a story in my head right now. I'm not saying it's true. I don't know that it is true, but there's a story in my head. Can I tell it to you and see whether or not it's true? Or you could say, hey, I sense we're in a conflict right now. Can we pause and then share the stories in our head to see what truth is there or there isn't, and to come to a better understanding of each other? I think that's a way we can start off the conversations. Well, that's what I have to share tonight. Again, my hope is that through tonight and through the class, we'll recognize more readily that there's story to listen to in our own heads, to take note of and process. There's story in other people's lives to be heard and drawn out and appreciated. And there's story in the minds of both parties, when in the midst of a conflict. All right. Well, I'm going to stop the recording there, and then I'm going to open it up for some questions. Again, this is Mark Olsey. To learn more, if somehow you get this, go to community.pledgetalk.com. And bye for now.